If the Jets are going to exceed low expectations in 2025, they need to party like it's 2006 or 2013 or 2022. Locked On Jets begins now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, July 8th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets, and today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, if we are going to be perfectly honest with each other, there are not many people expecting big things from the 2025 New York Jets. Their current projection with our partners FanDuel is 5.5 wins. FanDuel also gives the Jets the third lowest odds of any team in the league to win its division. So fair to say the Jets are expected to be one of the worst teams in the league. On today's show, we're going to take a look at 3 other seasons where the Jets had very low expectations going in and discuss how those teams exceeded expectations and how there may be parallels to the current Jets team. Now, this is a different season for the New York Jets than 2023 or 2024. This time, a year ago, 2 years ago, it was pretty cut and dry how we would measure success. It was Super Bowl or bust. The Jets, according to many people last year and 2 years ago, were a Super Bowl contender heading into training camp. As we know now, that wasn't really accurate. Those teams were pretty overrated. But the expectations are lower this year. This year, again, people are expecting the Jets to be one of the worst teams in the league. They have a first-year head coach. They have a first-year GM. Nobody thinks this is a Super Bowl team. And the measure of success has to be adjusted accordingly. As difficult as it is to say for a team that has the longest playoff drought in the NFL, and the longest playoff drought by 7 years, the Jets don't necessarily need to make the playoffs for us to feel good about this team this year. And this year is in many ways going to be about whether Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji seem like they have a handle on things. If it seems like they're moving the team in the right direction. And on today's show, I'm going to talk about 3 other years in the last 2 decades where the Jets entered the season with very low expectations and exceeded them. And only one of those years resulted in a playoff berth, and it was a wild card berth, and the Jets were bounced pretty easily in the first round. But I think on some level, all 3 of these years were successful for different reasons. And the first season I'm going to talk about is 2006. This was Eric Mangini's first year as a head coach. The Jets were widely expected to not be just one of the worst teams in the league, but they were widely expected to be the worst team in the league. They were coming off a 4-12 season. Their salary cap situation was a mess. The quarterback situation was very unstable. It kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? The 2005 Jets were a team that entered the season with Super Bowl expectations, and they were decimated by injuries. Chad Pennington suffered a second consecutive major shoulder surgery, so Herm Edwards went off to Kansas City. In comes Eric Mangini. Mike Tannenbaum's promoted to GM. Jets are expected to be the worst team in the league, and they end up surprising people. They end up winning 10 games and making the playoffs. So what are some of the lessons we can learn from the 2006 Jets? Well, I don't think it's fair to say that Jets team was short on talent, but they ended up being pretty talented in one key area. This was the year where they drafted DeBrickashaw Ferguson and Nick Mangold with their 2 first-round picks. So they built the makings of a really, really strong offensive line. And it was not yet a top 5 unit, the way it would grow into during the Rex Ryan years, because Damian Woody wasn't there yet. But the pieces started to come into place. And the Jets in 2006 had a vastly improved offensive line because of these 2 young guys that they added. And you look at the current Jets team, this is an offensive line that has the potential to be both young and very good, because you have 4 of the 5 starters who are going to be entering their 5th season or less. And at both tackle spots, you have a first-round pick who entered the league in the last 2 years. So these are unproven guys. Olu Fashanu and Armand Membou, both unproven players. Fashanu did play some pretty strong football near the end of last year. Membou is entering the league, but there's real talent on this offensive line. You have situations where you have a position where there's nothing but unproven guys, but it's difficult to see where the upside is. I mean, I'd say wide receiver might be an example of that with the Jets this year, because once you get past Garrett Wilson, you're dealing with veterans who are pretty unremarkable, like Josh Reynolds and Alan Lazard and Tyler Johnson, but you're also dealing with young guys who, at least on paper, don't seem like they have the highest ceilings. You got Arian Smith, you got Malachi Corley, you got Xavier Gibson, all those guys in the mix. But on the offensive line, the Jets may be unproven, but they have guys who have very high-end talent, guys who were high first-round picks in Membu and Fashanu, and guys who are high first-round picks within the last 2 years. And if all goes well for the Jets, they're not going to have to worry about the tackle position for the next 8 years. And obviously, it's a little different from 2006 because the Jets had a tackle and a center, and now they have 2 tackles. But two high-end young players can make a big difference on the offensive line. And when your offensive line can block people, your offense has a chance. We've seen this many times through recent years with the Jets, where the offensive line just wasn't talented enough. The Jets couldn't move anybody off the point of attack, and the offense really had no shot. Well, this year's Jets team has the shot to have a very good offensive line. That doesn't include the 3 guys on the interior. 2 of them are still pretty young. The 2 young guys, Joe Tippmann and Elijah Vera Tucker, and then the last piece of the puzzle is the left guard John Simpson, who, for all the awful and most of the 2024 offseason moves were awful for the Jets, John Simpson was a bright spot. So much like the 2006 Jets expected to be a pretty bad team this year. People kind of looking down on the talent of the roster, but there's real potential along the offensive line. And another parallel is the fact that Jets have a first-year coach this year in Aaron Glenn, just as they did that year with Eric Mangini. Now, Eric Mangini did not prove to be a good coach. 2 of his 3 years, the team was pretty bad. But there are certain things a coach can do. I think sometimes we expect too much of coaches. If a player struggles, we blame the coaching, and that's not always fair. Most of the time, it's really more on the player than the coaching. But the way I view coaches, the way I view their contributions is they should get as much as possible from the talent that they've got. And while Eric Mangini did not do that his second year or his third year, I think it's fair to say he did that his first year. And it's not always obvious. Sometimes it comes down to the fundamentals. Sometimes it comes down to knowing what to do in a certain situation. Playing smart situational football. That's stuff that you drill into players in practice. And other times it just comes down to like the fundamentals of technique. Are you protecting the football so it doesn't get fumbled? When you look at the great teams in the league, they have the star players. They have the high-end talent. But most of the great teams in this league don't beat themselves. It's one of the things I always said about like the Brady Patriots. I think it's also true of the Reed Mahomes Chiefs. The biggest reason they win is because of the quarterback. But high on the list is that they don't go out there and lose the game. They don't make the big mistake. Sometimes somebody outperforms them. Sometimes they lose on a fluke play, like the Patriots losing the Super Bowl to the Giants in 2008 because David Tyree pinned the ball with his hand to his helmet. A crazy catch. Sometimes you run into Nick Foles having the game of his life in the Super Bowl. But the good teams in this league very rarely beat themselves. The Jets aren't at that level this year, but we can start to see how good this coaching staff is based on the quality of the team's performance and how they execute the fundamentals. Is this a team that avoids turnovers? Is this a team where guys know where to be in a key spot? Is this a team where, if you're trying to ice out a win and all you need to do is run out the clock, you have a guy who falls down at the 1 yard line so you can run out the clock rather than score a touchdown? Those are like the little things that will start to add up over the course of the season. And those things will tell us the quality of Aaron Glenn as a coach. But those things can also contribute to victories because in this league, there are a lot of close games. And sometimes a team has a surprise season based on upsets in tight games. And those tight games can be decided by the little things. Here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about a team that was very, very good in tight games. That was the 2013 Jets. Now, that Jets team did not make the playoffs, but by all accounts, this was another team that exceeded expectations. And they showed us the role of randomness in the season and how the 2025 Jets can use randomness to their advantage. I'll explain as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to the ballpark with friends and family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize you want to be in the stands. That's exactly where Gametime comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last-minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merchandise, or even invite a bigger group to come with you. Gametime makes it possible. Gametime makes buying tickets fast and easy. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch, and they've got incredible last-minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. Of course, Yankees and Mets in action this summer if you want to go see them. You want to go see something on Broadway, you want to go see a concert, you want to see comedy, Gametime's got you covered. I've used the Gametime app on numerous occasions, got last-minute seats that were amazing at amazing prices. They also give you the view from your seat. You get a picture of what it's going to look like from your seat, so no surprises, no obstructed views when you arrive. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space, for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. Today, we're talking about recent seasons within the last 2 decades where the Jets exceeded expectations. And the reason we're talking about this is the Jets enter 2025 with pretty low expectations. Again, our friends at FanDuel have the Jets with an over-under of 5.5 wins and the third lowest odds of any team in the league to win its division. I have to say, I don't hate the idea that the Jets have low expectations this year, because we've entered the last couple seasons with sky-high expectations. And that's not unusual for the Jets. The Jets are frequently one of the flashiest teams in the offseason. The Jets are always the team that makes the big offseason moves and generates all the hype. And they've been the ultimate over-promise and under-deliver team in the league the last decade and a half. So I don't think it's a bad thing that they enter the season with low expectations, because there's a pretty good chance they're going to exceed those expectations. And I think there are 3 teams in recent, over the last 20 years that really exceeded expectations. And, unfortunately, because the Jets have been so unsuccessful as a franchise, only one of those teams made the playoffs. But I don't think this Jets team needs to make the playoffs in 2025 for us to feel good about the direction of the franchise. So the next team I wanted to discuss was the 2013 Jets. And much like the 2006 Jets, this was expected to be the worst team in the league. Not just one of the worst teams. The 2013 Jets were expected to be the worst team in the league. It was another situation where the salary cap was ugly. The general manager had been fired, Mike Tannenbaum. Rex Ryan was allowed to return, but the team was not really able to make many upgrades in the offseason. They were coming off a terrible year. They were coming off the Tebow year in 2012, where the Jets went 6-10. And this Jets team, with a rookie quarterback, Geno Smith, because Mark Sanchez somewhat infamously got injured in the second half of a preseason game. There was a lot of debate at the time whether he should have been in there, because he was probably the team's starting quarterback. But Geno Smith took over, and the Jets went 8-8. And in many ways, this was an 8-8 that was done with smoke and mirrors, because the Jets did not have a huge offseason in 2014, despite having a lot of cap space. And they essentially brought most of the same team back the next year and went 4-12. And, if you look at that 2013 team, this was a team that scored 290 points. They allowed 387. So they allowed almost 100 more points than they scored. But they still were able to finish 8-8. They were not great defensively. They were not great offensively. They weren't great at, Geno Smith was a rookie who was very raw. Geno, of course, has developed into a quality starting quarterback in the years since, but, he had kind of a rough season. But the Jets were still able to go 8-8. And the driving force behind that was a 5-1 record in games decided by 1 score or less. And we talk a lot on this show about the randomness of the NFL. And people don't like to hear this, because you like to think that there's merit in the league. You like to think the best teams always win, that everything's always fair, but that's not the way the NFL works. In a league where around half the games are decided by 1 score or less, there are lots of randomness. There's lots of randomness. And there are undermanned teams like the 2013 Jets, which can sneak their way to a 500 record with a 5-1 record in games decided by 1 score or less. In 2024, the Jets were 3-7 in games decided by 1 score or less. So what are the factors that go into this? Well, there is some luck. There's no question about it. I mean, one bad call can hurt your team. One bad bounce of the ball can hurt your team or help your team. But there are things that can determine your success in close games. One of them is special teams. I think anybody who watched the 2024 Jets would conclude that they had bad special teams. And I think people get a little simplistic when they say special teams was the difference between the Jets being bad and good in 2024. I don't know how you look at the rest of the roster and say that, but it is clear that the Jets had some big special teams failures in key spots. Again, I think coaching goes into this. You don't want to be the team that makes the big mistake. And in some cases, you benefit from the other team being the club that makes the big mistake. In 2013, the Jets won a game opening day. I actually remember I was at MetLife Stadium for that game, where a personal foul on Levante David. He hit Geno Smith on a scramble as he was going out of bounds on the last series. And the Jets seemed like they were finished at this point. I mean, it was a desperation drive, but a 15-yard penalty put the Jets just into Nick Folk's field goal range, and Folk made a field goal to beat the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. A little bit later in the year, in October, the Jets played an overtime game against the Patriots, and Nick Folk missed a field goal that would have won it, but the Patriots lined up incorrectly. They had a guy covering the center, so it was another 15-yard penalty, set the Jets up for a win. You don't want to be the team that makes those mistakes, and part of that's on coaching. Part of it's just being the team that benefits from the other team's big mistakes. When you're undermanned, and I think it's clear that in many games when the Jets take the field this year, they're going to be the lesser of the two teams. Now, I don't think this Jets team lacks talent the way the 13 team did. I don't think they lack talent the way the 06 team did. So I think that will help. But essentially, you can win a game in the NFL. The old expression is any given Sunday. A less talented team can beat a more talented team. It's just the margin for error is lower. It means that your best guys can't have an off day. It means you can't be the team making the big mistakes. It means that you have to execute the fundamentals effectively, and you need to hope that the other team doesn't. And I think that there are some clear lessons to be learned from the way the 2013 Jets took advantage of situations that were in front of them. The Jets could have given away those games against Tampa Bay and New England. They could have given away, some of the other tight games that they won. The game against the Saints, they won a very tight game against a good Saints team that year. They won a nail biter against the Buffalo Bills at home. The Jets avoided the big mistakes in those games. Was it coaching? I don't know, but they were a team that was able to take advantage of the other team's big mistakes. They didn't, when you're the lesser of the two teams, you can't make unforced errors. And I think the Jets were very good at avoiding those because there has to be something that makes up the talent gap. The other team's better than you. You need to play at a higher level than they do. If the other team is a little bit better than you, and they play their B game, you need to play your A game. And that's something we saw the Jets do frequently that year. Just because you're the less talented team doesn't mean you're incapable of winning. In the NFL, everybody's good. It's something I need to avoid doing. It's something I do too often is I say a guy's not a good player. Everybody in the NFL is a good player. Some guys are better than others. But if the better player doesn't play his best game and the lesser player plays his best game, the lesser player can win. And that's what happened many times in 2013 for the Jets. And look, I think the base case for the 2025 Jets is that they're probably not going to be that great of a team. But if they bring their best game, the other team overlooks them the way it happened in 2013 frequently. This Jets team could surprise you. During the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about one final Jets team. It's a Jets team that's more recent than the first two we've discussed. It's the 2022 Jets, who had a very rough end to their season. But the 2022 Jets offered a blueprint for the current team that could lead to more success. And I'll explain what that is as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Tuesday. We're talking about Jets teams within the last 20 years who have exceeded expectations. And not all of these teams made the playoffs. In fact, only one of the three teams we're discussing today made the postseason. But I don't think that the measure for success for the 2025 Jets is necessarily whether they make the playoffs. I think that we can feel good about this team even if they don't make the playoffs. Now, that doesn't mean like anything's acceptable. This Jets team goes out and goes 4-13. We're going to view the season as a failure. But I think that if this Jets, there will certainly be ways we'll feel like this Jets team is on the right track after the season if they hit certain benchmarks. And I think back to a recent Jets team. That was the 2022 team that had a horrible finish to the season. They finished 7-10, but they got off to a good start that year. They started the season 7-4. They had a 4-game winning streak in October, and it was really the breakout party for a lot of young players. It was Garrett Wilson's rookie year. It was Sauce Gardner's rookie year. Breece Hall, before he got injured in October, looked like he was on the verge of becoming one of the top 5 running backs in the league. And there was other talent sprinkled around. And I have a lot of lament about the 2022 season because that to me was like the first time it felt like the Jets had legitimate direction as a franchise in quite a while. And we all know what followed. And one of my biggest frustrations is that the Jets had this core of young talents. And for me, like the direction the team should have gone was building around them. Making these players the center point, the centerpiece of the franchise, and filling in the talent around them. Jets went in a different direction. Jets imported a Hall of Fame quarterback who was kind of at the end of his career and bringing in all of his friends. And we saw how the last 2 years went. When I say bringing his friends, I mean bringing players who are his friends, bringing an offensive coordinator who's his friend. It did not go well. 2025 gives the Jets a chance to start anew and kind of like backtrack and start building around these pieces, who are now maybe not so much young anymore, but players who are entering their prime. Garrett, Sauce, Jermaine Johnson, who coming back from an injury, who has developed into a good player. And also, you look back at the 2021 draft class. It's kind of weird to say it because the Jets completely messed up the second overall pick with Zach Wilson. They messed up the pick number 2 at all at quarterback. They also messed up a pick at the top of the second round at wide receiver by picking Elijah Moore. It's not often you mess up 2 high picks at players of premium positions, but you still come away feeling like, that was actually a pretty decent draft, because 2021 was also the year where the Jets picked Elijah Vera Tucker and they picked Jamie and Sherwood and they picked Michael Carter II. Jets got 3 quality starters out of that draft, despite messing up a quarterback pick at 2 and a wide receiver pick at the top of the first round. There are actually lots of decent pieces on this team right now. Quinnen Williams is another one. So this team is different from like where the Jets were under Adam Gase, because under Adam Gase, the Jets really had no talent. I mean, I think the first year they had Jamal Adams and Marcus May, and it was Quinnen Williams' rookie season, but there really weren't many quality players on that roster. Things are different now. Jets have quality pieces, and this goes back to like the Joe Douglas era, and I feel like Joe Douglas is a GM who like nobody can properly rate. You have people who act like he was like the worst GM in the league, and he wasn't. You look at the pieces he added. Then you also have people who act like he was this great GM who was short-circuited by the Jets' incompetence. And while there's some truth to that, there's some truth to that he was short-circuited by the Jets' incompetence, especially from the ownership. He missed on too many picks. The one thing I'd say about Joe Douglas is that he's probably the first GM since Parcells who left the team in a better shape than he found it, because there is this base of talent now on this roster. There were other GMs, like Mike Tannenbaum inherited a team that wasn't very good, took them to pretty high heights, but then things fell apart. And by the end, they were about as bad as the team he inherited when he first took over. I think it's fair to say Joe Douglas is the first Jets GM since Parcells who left the team in a better spot than he found it. And the Jets are now going to be able to lean on this core in a way they haven't the last couple of years. Because the last couple of years, everything was about Aaron Rodgers. It was about, does Rodgers have the coach he wants? Does Rodgers have the receiver he wants? Well, we got to throw the ball to Allen Lazard and Devontae Adams. Sorry, Garrett. Well, the Jets had this talented core that lifted them to a good start in 2022. And ultimately, the team's quarterback issues were too big to overcome that year. And this year, you'll hope you get better quality quarterback play out of Justin Fields. I don't think anybody's expecting Justin Fields to play at like a Burrow or Mahomes or Jackson or Allen level. The question is like whether Justin Fields can play at a stable enough level, at a level the Jets did not get in 2022. Because that year, if the Jets had gotten quality quarterback play, if the Jets had gotten decent quarterback play, they probably would have been a playoff team. Now, I don't know that the rest of the pieces are quite there for the Jets to be a playoff team this year, even if Justin Fields plays at a decent level. But I do feel like the pieces are there for the Jets to have a relatively successful season. And part of this will be Sauce Gardner refining the form of his first 2 years. There'll be Garrett Wilson continuing to produce at the level he's produced. There'll be Jermaine Johnson showing he's recovered from an injury. There'll be Jamie and Sherwood continuing to show the growth that he showed in 2024. And part of it will be Breece Hall. This Jets team has a real opportunity to be a dominant rushing team. I've thrown the number out over the last couple of months that 2,600 yards is the magic number for me, because I would put the Jets, in the true upper echelon of the league rushing wise in terms of rushing yards. And Jets have a quarterback who's a dynamic rusher in Fields. Breece Hall, through the first 6 weeks or so of 2022, looked like he was on his way to being a dominant back. And we've seen flashes of that guy since. We've seen games where he's shown that ability. but he hasn't like quite put the pieces together the way he did in the early part of 2022. In early 2022, he looked like he could be the go-to guy on the Jets offense. He looked like a guy that the offense could be built around. He was a guy the Jets offense was built around. And I don't think it gets discussed enough that the Jets' fall from grace in 2022 had a lot to do with Breece Hall getting injured. They won a couple games after that, but Breece Hall was the guy who kind of like helped them mask a lot of their deficiencies on offense during their 4-game winning streak in the middle of the season. And after he went down, the offense didn't really have anywhere to go. The Jets now can lean on this core. I don't know if it's called a young core anymore. These are now a lot of guys who are on their second contract or about to get their second contract. These are guys who are in their prime. And going forward, they just need to fill in around these guys the way they did not after 2022. But in 2022, you saw real progress from this team for the first time in quite a while. It really felt to me like the Jets were heading in the right direction because they had a core of talent, and that core of talent is still there. And this core of talent can help the Jets exceed expectations if they rely on it in 2025. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast first, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow, we're going to do a mailbag. It's been a while since we've done a mailbag, so I'll take your questions. Can't wait to answer them.